going to get started here. Welcome everybody to tonight's program. My name is Jessica McDonald, and I am the president of the League of Women Voters of Corvallis, your co-host of tonight's meeting, along with the Corvallis Albany branch of the NAACP. The League is a century-old, nonpartisan education and advocacy organization dedicated to empowering voters and defending democracy. The mission of the NAACP is to ensure the political, educational, social, and economic equality of the rights of all persons and to eliminate race-based discrimination. I invite you to join me. Get involved with these organizations if you're not already. Become a member, a volunteer, an advocate. For the League, I invite you to join us next week on March 2nd at 6 p.m. for an informative program on pathways towards a national popular vote and removing the electoral college system, featuring leading voices in this effort, including Kristen Eberhardt, Director of Climate and Democracy at the Sightline Institute, and Eileen Reeby, National Grassroots Director at the nonprofit National Popular Vote. Now tonight, I am looking forward to this discussion that explores barriers to affordable housing. This education on barriers is an integral step in moving towards solutions. I'm grateful to the League's Housing Committee for their work to put this program together and to our esteemed panelists for speaking this evening. I'm going to pass the virtual microphone off to Tabitha Chula, our moderator for this evening, and to lead us into this program. Welcome, Tabitha.
Welcome everyone. I'm excited to have you guys all virtually here. So welcome to our program, Barriers to Affordable Housing for People of Color. And so before we start, just like a couple logistic Zoom things is we do have a Q&A feature available. So as we're going through the program, if you have any questions or anything that you want to ask of our panelists or anyone, you're able to go ahead and type in your questions there. They won't show up. They'll just show up to me that I can read them here at the end, and we'll have some Q&A time at the end. And then my internet is being a little wonky right now. So if I do go out, I've got people in queue that are willing to jump in. And so I just want to thank you guys all for coming. And so in the next hour, our panelists, Erin Harris and Joan Reukauf, are going to be talking about access to housing opportunities and the implications our racially segmented housing market has had on people of color. Across our state and nationally, there are still some significant impacts from racist policies set in place by our government that led way to disparities in wealth, housing access, education opportunities, equity building, and more that continue to impact people of color every day. Our local League of Women Voters Housing Committee chose this topic because even as a group whose grassroots is focused on housing policy and increasing equitable access to housing opportunities for everyone in our community, there is still so much we have to learn to become better advocates, and this stands true for each and every member of our community. Advocates and policymakers alike must educate themselves and acknowledge the well-documented historic patterns of racial discrimination in housing and land use policies. This program is intended to be a starting point for this conversation and to learn more about those impacts and begin the conversation around how we can address them. We need to talk about the role our housing policy has in causing our nation's racial disparities and the role it must play in solving them. And this is where I'm excited to introduce our panelists to share their knowledge and input on these topics. With us today, we have Erin Harris, Associate Planner with the City of Corvallis, and Joan Reukauf, the CEO of the Albany Willamette Community Bank. And then I will let them introduce themselves. So Erin?
Yeah, I'm Erin Harris. First of all, thanks for having me this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been at the City of Corvallis for the past 5 years. I got my undergrad, the focus in planning at Portland State University. I got my master's degree in community and regional planning at the University of Oregon in 2013. My first job was with the City of Coos Bay and then the City of Medford. And I've been with the City of Corvallis for the past 5 years. My day-to-day job is a lot of project management, whether it be a subdivision or some other type of development. I'm also currently working on some area planning efforts right now, specifically in South Corvallis, working on area plan there. And the places where I really like to focus my attention in my line of work is in equity issues and sustainability. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Erin. We're excited to have you talk and share today. And Joan, if you just want to take a minute to introduce yourself as well before we jump in, that would be great.
Of course. Good evening, everyone. My name is Joan Reukauf. I'm the president and CEO of Willamette Community Bank based in Albany, Oregon. I've been in banking for 28 plus years. That seems weird to say, but I grew up actually in Idaho and went to school at Boise State University. I got my bachelor's degree in marketing, business administration, and then moved to Oregon in 2010 for the current bank that I work for today. So yes, I am a banker. Don't hold that against me, but I'm really excited to share with you sort of what happens in my world and how that impacts what we're going to talk about today. I also went to Willamette University and got my MBA there. Next week, actually, you will see that my bank is actually merging with another bank down south called People's Bank of Commerce. So we're actually pretty excited about that, but glad to be here and really looking forward to Erin's presentation and the discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joan. Congratulations on the merger. And so before we jump in, I just want to thank both of you for taking the time out of your evening to participate in the program and share your expertise. And I will just give the virtual floor over to Erin to jump on in.
All right. See if I can replicate. Let's see here. Not quite yet. Give me a second here.
No worries. And just a reminder, as he's getting his screen all set up, as you have questions as he's going through his program, as you can just drop them into the Q&A chat, and we'll have a good section here at the end that we can run through them. Awesome. You're good to go.
Am I good to go? Does that look right?
Yep. Perfect.
Okay. All right, so I'd like to kick things off with a general assertion that land use policy, embodied and expressed in various ways, including the Land Development Code, municipal codes, plats, ordinances, covenants, and so forth, they're a reflection of our community's values. They're a reflection of a community's values. They're tailored to promote those things that we hold dear and to mitigate and or keep distant those things which we do not. Land use policies define who belongs where, and who doesn't belong at all. So keeping that in mind, I'd like to provide some context for our discussion this evening with some census data. Oregon ranks 14th amongst the whitest states in the union, as you can see from this table. Hawaii is the least white state, West Virginia being the most white state, and we rank slightly less white than Idaho and slightly more white than South Dakota. When we compare national demographics with Oregon state data and data at the local level, we see that the United States is 72.5% white. Oregon, by comparison, is 83.5% white. Corvallis is slightly higher than the state average at 84.3%. Median household income for a white family in the United States is about $69,000 a year, compared to a black family, that's $42,000. That's to say that the average income for a white family in the United States is 64% higher than the average income for a black family. In Oregon, that discrepancy is slightly lower at 54%. Black households still make slightly less than the national average, but that's mostly, the difference is mostly made up because white median household income is lower than that national average. So why is Oregon so white? Why is there such a disparity in household earnings? Why are we having conversations like this one about housing and affordability and people of color? How did we get here? I think a significant component of the short answer is that Oregon has a profoundly racist past. In 1844, Oregon passed a Lash Law when it was still just a territory. The law prohibited Black people from living in the territory for more than 3 years. The consequence of breaking the law was 39 lashes every 6 months until you left. Another Black exclusion law was passed 5 years later in 1849. This one barring Black people from entering or residing in Oregon territory altogether. In 1859, Oregon becomes the 33rd state in the Union. It's the only state to forbid Black people from working, living, or owning property within its borders. The Portland Board of Realty Code of Ethics was approved in 1919, the Code of Ethics. It contained a passage which stated that a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. The code worked in coordination with restrictive covenants that explicitly prohibited the sale or transfer of properties to specific racial, national, or religious group members in order to create a barrier against non-white home ownership in all white communities. So these are just a few of a litany of examples of racism baked into policy here in Oregon, beginning even prior to our statehood. The following are a couple examples that I was able to track down at the local level. Take a field trip over to Springer Tracks in Corvallis. This is located just off of Northwest Buchanan Avenue and across the street from the Corvallis High School. Lots 4, 5, and 6 of Block 2 are highlighted in blue. And here we see the restrictive covenant that currently runs with the property. It's not legally enforced, but somebody just pulled the record a little bit ago. It was recorded in 1949, 72 years ago. I've blown up the applicable portion of the text at the bottom of the slide. It reads that no person or persons of African or Asiatic descent shall be permitted to own or purchase the above described premises. Here's an aerial of Oak Lawn Cemetery situated along Brooklyn Drive next to the Corvallis Country Club golf course. And here is the plat recorded in 1959, so just 62 years ago, and it reads, "Only those of Caucasian or white race shall be buried there, and none other." I pulled this document off the county's website myself a few days ago. So we're having this conversation this evening because we acknowledge that we still face significant racial equity issues, and we still see racist outcomes, even though many of our modern policies are no longer explicitly racist. So is there anything that we can glean from these excerpts of state and local history that helps inform our community's more recent land use policies? I'm not going to attempt to answer that question this evening, but I do think it's a question that we should all take to heart and stay mindful of, particularly when we're contemplating land use policy. So this is the cover of our Imagine Corvallis 24 document. This is our envisioning document. And here's a brief excerpt. Corvallis is a safe, secure, and welcoming community for everyone. It's identified as a community value. It's an aspirational statement that helps memorialize what we're striving to achieve. Personally, I love Corvallis, and I think it's a great place full of fantastic people. And I think we're absolutely making efforts to achieve the vision. But anecdotally, I can also tell you that I often get phone calls and receive public testimony where a development proposal contains a multifamily component and it gets called things like an abomination or a monstrosity. On multiple occasions, I've even been told outright, well, I just don't want poor people living next to me. All right. So let's now look at some housing and population data and how some of that information relates to local land use policy. A lot of this information is on the city's website on the Housing and Neighborhood Services page if you'd like to take a look for yourself. This slide identifies Corvallis population from 1960 to present. We can see that the population has grown pretty modestly in the last 20 years, from 49,000 people in 2000 to 59,000 people in 2020. This chart identifies acres annexed by decade. You can see on this chart that in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, Corvallis annexed over 1,000 acres per decade. In the 90s, that number dropped by 75%. And in the 2010s, only 161 acres were annexed. Annexation policy speaks directly to this question of who belongs and who doesn't. Personally, I find Corvallis's history of annexation policy really fascinating. In 1973, the Oregon Legislative Assembly enacted a statute delegating to all counties the power to enact local legislation on matters of county concern. Corvallis immediately, in that same year, imposed an annexation law that put any annexation to a vote of the people. Can one argue that there's a good reason to put annexations to the vote? Sure. Does this form of public involvement potentially open the door to explicit and/or implicit bias, since there's no clear and objective standard which helps determine who gets to be a part of the community and who does not? Absolutely. There's no way to discern why votes get cast one way or another. In 2016, the state of Oregon passed an emergency law that requires annexation decisions to be made by governing bodies of cities and not by the voters. The state passed this bill as a part of a larger package of bills crafted to increase housing affordability. Corvallis elected to challenge this law in court. On this slide, we see that over time, median price of single-family homes continues to climb higher, rapidly outpacing the annual median family income. And this is happening at the same time that the community has drastically reduced the amount of land being annexed into city limits. I would assert that policies put into place to limit the expansion of a city creates financial advantage to existing homeowners, while at the same time placing home ownership further out of reach for those who are not already in the in crowd. So who's on the outside? This chart illustrates the growing number of Corvallis commuters by year. You can see that the number of in commuters, people coming into Corvallis to work every day, has grown substantially, while the number of out commuters and the number of people who both live and work in Corvallis has stayed relatively consistent. But think about this. Last year, the city issued 81 building permits. The city would need to build 177 housing units per year, every year, until 2036 to meet the pent-up demand of our projected population growth. And those numbers do not account for what we're seeing on this slide, the roughly 21,000 in commuters entering Corvallis daily for work. So what kind of ripple effects does this scenario have for our community as it relates to some of our other expressed values? Let's take a look at climate change as an example, where again, in our vision document, we have aspirational goals about where we want to go as a community. So here we see that the transportation emissions accounted for 15% of our community's greenhouse gas emissions in 2018. In some areas, Corvallis's emission rates have increased at a higher rate than population growth, and that holds true for transportation emissions. Personal and commercial vehicle-related emissions rose a little bit over 9% from 2012 to 2018. All right, so last topic, I would be remiss if I didn't spend at least a few minutes discussing off-street parking. It's a topic that really lies at the intersection of affordable housing, of climate change, and transportation policy. So the slide that you're seeing here, this is like one of my favorite images illustrating how much of the modern city, just how much of our urban form is designed to accommodate the automobile. So post-World War II, we saw a boom in audio-oriented development, right? Everybody had a car. It was part of the American dream. And we really built our cities to account for that. Off-street parking was free. It still often is. And it's a gigantic subsidy for the auto-oriented world. But increasingly across this country and specifically here in the state of Oregon, there's now a lot of attention being placed on minimum parking requirements. One factor in play is that minimum parking requirements make an assumption about car ownership. It may be a well-meaning assumption, but the implication is that people that don't own a car still need to provide for them. Maybe they can't afford a car, maybe they want to pursue a different type of lifestyle, but traditional policies imply that you're an outlier if you don't own one, and that you need to provide for cars regardless. With climate change and affordable housing concerns, people are beginning to question that value in these policies. Should we treat off-street parking like other municipal utilities? Should we charge fees like we do for water, for sewer, and so forth? When you price it, the need for minimum requirements goes away because those who want a car, they pay for that right. Those who don't want to carry the financial burden don't have to. And right now, those who do not opt into car ownership are still obligated to help carry those costs. The principal concern that I hear from the community is that people are concerned that you're going to jam up parking on the street. People also don't want folks parking in front of their homes. I want to acknowledge that concern. It's a reality. It's not lost on me. But that said, personally, I think that the reduction or elimination of off-street parking requirements is the #1 policy change we could make to address the affordable housing crisis. Climate change as well. So let's look at one local example. Here's the Gazette-Times building on Jefferson Avenue. This development provides 28 dwelling units and 98 parking spaces, and that's the minimum required by our land development code. So that translates to almost 16,000 square feet of vehicle storage, equal to about 32 additional one-bedroom homes at 500 square feet on the ground floor level. You can see that well over half of this block has been allocated for cars. When developers are required to put aside a portion of the site for parking, it increases costs and provides an advantage to market rate housing. In contrast, reducing or eliminating parking requirements decreases costs and can provide an advantage to more affordable housing. So just a couple more examples, and I have to look the other way because my screens are a little bit weird. So this is an example from Portland. This is from an article. In mid-density areas, one factor determines whether lots are likely to redevelop as high-cost townhomes or mixed-income condos for middle and working class. An average of 1.5 off-street parking spots required makes luxury condos the most profitable development for a developer to build. But without a required parking standard, the most profitable development is now mixed-income buildings. Here's an example from Seattle. In 2012, off-street parking requirements were eliminated for multifamily housing in urban centers. Since 2017, 18,000 fewer parking spaces across over 26,000 units have been built. Assuming that each of the parking spaces cost $30,000 to build, the reform saved $537 million in direct construction costs over 5 years. That's more than $20,000 per unit. So in conclusion, land use policy is expressed in a variety of ways. It's a reflection of our values. Racism has played a fundamental role in forming policies at all locals of government, including here in our community. Individuals and communities often hold multiple conflicting values simultaneously, and policy requires that we make difficult choices about which values we want to prioritize. And my last point is that, in my opinion, off-street parking requirements are the #1 barrier to the development of more affordable housing, at least from a land development standpoint. So if affordable housing and or climate change are our principal values, then I think the community should be taking a hard look at the reduction or wholesale elimination of off-street parking requirements. If our values are maintaining the existing neighborhood character or ensuring that folks aren't parking in front of our homes or something else, that may be fine. But as a community, I think that we should be honest about which of our values we choose to prioritize. And with that, I will cede the floor, turn it back over to Tabitha. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. It's interesting just to kind of learn about our policies and see that we still have some deeds with some restrictions listed on our books and kind of see how that plays out. I thank you for sharing that. I will, before we kind of jump into any of those Q&A questions, turn the floor over to Joan just to share her information.
All right. Well, thank you, Tabitha. And Erin, I'm sitting here thinking, I got to follow that. Great presentation.
Thank you.
I told Erin before we started that I wanted him to take as much time as he could because I knew his report would be good. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of the same message that Erin told you. I don't have an answer to some of these things, but what I can tell you is how it works today. And, in listening to Erin's presentation, there's a couple of things that stuck out to me that, some things that I wanted to mention, and that is our past laws, our past, things that we had in place, what we've done in the way of keeping people away, keeping people down. It's still having its effect. As much as we would love to think that it doesn't, it does. And Erin, I think you did a remarkable job of showing us why that is and how that is. Now, would we advocate or condone any of those laws today? No, I don't think that we would. However, the fact that they were there in the past has set us up for a today that is really hard to reverse and get around. And what I mean by that is when we think about affordable housing, as I was looking at the numbers, and I was looking at more sort of a Benton County picture, in order to accommodate those folks that are deemed in the poverty level, we need 4 times more of the affordable housing than we have today. And when we're fighting sort of the fight of, I don't want this in my neighborhood, or, I don't want, my Corvallis to look this way, that's the wrong answer, in my opinion. I told you I don't have the right answer, but if we're looking at this problem, looking at the fact that we need 4 times the affordable housing than we do today just to help and house these people, that's a problem in itself. My expertise, or what I am going to focus on, is home ownership, and how in the world we're going to fix that problem and get around that barrier. So for some of the same reasons, you saw the income levels, you saw the disparity. This just leaks right over into home ownership. And I want to talk just a little bit, and I won't take too long because I would love to get to some of your questions about why that is. So I am going to reflect just a little bit on 2008 and the lovely financial crisis that we had. If you think about what was happening before that, now we were still having the problem of barriers when it comes to people of color and home ownership, but it was easier to actually get into a home, but for the wrong reasons. And as a result of that, and I don't disagree with this because we needed to regulate some of these things, we had more regulation put in place. So today, to try to actually get into a home, it is harder to do that even back then when we had the deregulation. So even that's not an answer, right? You've got all kinds of programs out there. Programs that are normally funded by some sort of government money. So that means it's limited. You've got down payment assistance. You've got all of these things that you can seek out, but it also takes education. For those of us who have gone through buying a home, it is not an easy ordeal. And so any sort of education that we can get out there, I'm a huge advocate of. And there's not enough. We don't have access to it in enough places. And so I really think that that's a huge problem out there, that we really need to make sure that we're advocating, that we're getting this information out there, because there are dollars to be had, education to be had, to help people get into homes that they can afford. Now let's talk about that word afford. Erin, you showed the slide about the values of homes going up relative to the income levels. That's a problem. And unfortunately, when you talk to a banker, we just get to look at the numbers. There's a history of redlining. There's a history of all of those things that has made certain neighborhoods and communities unfortunately less desirable on purpose, which is just an unfortunate thing. And if you ever have, and I'm sure some of you out there have read history on redlining, it's fascinating but upsetting how we would purposely keep people in a certain area and it would just become dilapidated and then they couldn't go anywhere. Why? Erin, you said it great. They don't have a car. They can't afford one. They can't just pick up and move somewhere as easily as possibly someone who, is white and has had opportunity and access. So here we are again, keeping people where they can't move. They can't really move forward. They can't advance, and they can't make things better for themselves. So one of the things in sort of researching some of this for my world that I came across, and of course it was really disheartening, is trust. And which I don't blame people for not having trust, especially in banks. But unfortunately, the mistrust is very high in people of color, which, I take to heart. But one of those reasons is because there's not a lot of people that look like me in the financial industries. And if you look in Oregon, there's certainly not a lot of people of color when you walk into a bank or when you go into that mortgage office. So I think another thing that, and actually I'm proud to be a part of, another thing that needs to happen is to advocate and educate people of color to rise up and join financial industries so that we can be a part of helping this problem in the future. I am a member of the Oregon Bankers Association. I'm actually on their board, and I'm also a member of their foundation, which is taking up this issue of getting more people of color in management positions and decision-making positions so that they can influence the programs that their financial institutions offer to help with this kind of problem out there in the future. And so I'm very proud that I'm a part of that, but one little program in Oregon is not going to, solve the miseries of the world when it comes to this, because certainly it's all over. Hopefully we can help something when it comes to Oregon. But in my world, that's kind of what we concentrate on. Mortgage is mortgage. You're going to have to qualify. You're going to have capital. You're going to have collateral, and you're going to have to be able to afford it. And that right there is just an issue in itself for this population that we're talking about. And so, again, I don't have the answer to that. So that's something that we'll have to keep working on. But those programs and education, and then, of course, promoting from within, promoting people of color to be able to make some of those decisions and get those programs in place, I think that's a pretty good start. So with that, I'll yield the floor and let's get to people's questions.
Thank you so much, Joan. It's a lot of good information. I know we work with a lot of families through Habitat that we come across that where they've shown up in banks and it's just not seeing kind of familiar faces or being able to have access to materials in their language. So I think that's a really good effort that we're kind of working on. So we can jump into some of the questions here. And so it looks like we've got a couple towards Erin. Someone asking, will you talk about HB 2003 and the new housing production strategies to be considered in the future related to housing needs?
I believe they're referencing House Bill 2001. And so there is a lot to that bill, and I don't have my head wrapped around a lot of the details there. But at a high level, what we're talking about is that on any lot that's zoned for residential development, it it will make it it'll provide an allowance for single family homes, duplexes, also triplexes and fourplexes. So it will no longer permit a city to say, you can't build a townhome, say here on this low density lot. Now, in Corvallis, we have 3 low density zoning designations, but 2 of them are sort of old, outdated zones that you really couldn't apply to a lot today if you came in for an annexation or a zone change. So our RS6, which is sort of like the current low density zone, it already allows for all of those housing types, provided that you can meet some of the other development standards like minimum lot size, things of that nature. And so the House bill is going to address some of those things as well. So that will be a change there. But really big picture, it is trying to address the housing affordability issue and trying to provide these opportunities for increased housing variety and restricts a city's ability to tell a developer, no, at this site here, this is only zoned for a single family home and none other. So that's sort of the high level there. Everything that happens with that bill is predicated on the idea that a developer is going to come in and that they're going to want to do a development on that given site, and probably some sort in Corvallis, we don't have it because of our history of annexation. We don't have a lot of greenfield sites. So, that's not to say that somebody might come through with a subdivision and decide to build some of these housing types, but it is to say that, for a lot of scenarios, you would probably see somebody need to tear down something existing in order to build this, which is part of the reason why I say that off-street parking is really the name of the game, because there's just so much space in our communities that we've allotted to just concrete for cars.
And then I think we have a couple follow-up chats about, I think they are referenced in House Bill 2003 with some notes that it requires cities over 25,000 to consider who needs housing in their area. And then another note that it requires cities to create housing production strategies on a schedule that the DLCD established.
I see. I'm not familiar with the House bill. I'm not the city's housing planner. And I probably should know more about that bill, but I'm just not familiar with it. So I apologize that I can't speak.
That's perfect. We can jump into another question. So we have a question for Joan. You mentioned there being mistrust with people of color and financial institutions, and one of the reasons being there are few people of color working in these institutions. Are there other reasons for this mistrust that you can speak to?
Yeah, I mean, one word that I mentioned, redlining. I think once you read about that, I don't know how you trust again, but it is illegal. So, and we are heavily regulated. So I feel very confident in saying that, and I can't speak for every bank out there because I'm sure there, if I do, there will be someone that crops up that says, they've done it wrong. But I think the mistrust comes in, unfortunately, in probably misinformation, but also in bad actors that we've had in banking and in financial institutions. And again, we're heavily regulated. So if you're caught doing some of these things, if you're caught denying a loan simply based on, color, race, sex, all of those things that are protected, that's illegal. And so but it happens, and it has happened in the past. And so I get it. I think the other mistrust is it can get complicated. And I'm not saying that people aren't smart. People are very smart. I think I'm kind of smart, and I get a little caught up in a lot of the legalese that are in some of these documents. And so now you're having to rely on someone to explain them to you. I think that sometimes, and I think, anyone, whether you're a person of color or not, that gets, you should be a little wary of that and be able to really understand what's going on there. But I think just the bad actors of the past, and hopefully not bad actors today, but, as soon as I say that, I'm going to read in the news tomorrow that somebody's done something wrong. But here's an example, and I can't prove this, but and this doesn't have to do with housing, but I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the PPP program that's going on right now, the Payment Protection Program. And one of the things, right now we're in a 14-day sort of freeze on any business getting a PPP loan that has more than 20 employees. Why are they doing this? Why did the administration do this? They did this so that they could capture more of those small businesses, but also they're not capturing what they think are minority-owned businesses. I actually think that they might be capturing them, but they're not answering the questions. They actually went and changed the application as well, so that it's the questions about race and veteran status and all of that is on the first page. So they want to say, oh, they missed it because it was on the second page. I disagree. I think they're not answering the question. And it's because when you've answered the question in the past, you possibly were punished for it. When you say that you're African American or you're Asian or Native American. And so that's one example. Again, I can't prove it, but that's a good example of mistrust and feeling like you may not get approved if you put it on there.
Okay. So I think a really good example, and I'm sure some other affordable housing providers are familiar with it, but I think we see that a lot when we have clients walk through our doors, that it's a lot of legalese and they aren't always understanding them. And affordable housing programs do have the opportunity to kind of work and walk through with clients, which there's not always that opportunity, like you're mentioning, there's not always the education for people going through it. So I think it's a really nice point. To both of you, someone is asking, the fact remains that building affordable housing is not profitable for builders, and cities are often not able to offset things like system development charges or offer other incentives, which can greatly reduce municipal budgets. What options are there to build affordable housing that are available where both the city and builders are not required to subsidize the housing? Either of you have.
Yeah, so go ahead. You go ahead.
Well, that's a really good question because capitalism is certainly alive and well. So a builder's not going to build something out of the kindness of their heart. And as much as the city wants to diversify and provide affordable housing, they can only go so far with their budget, right? So I don't have an answer, but I think it's going to fall on the city. I think that we have to make an effort and a decision, a conscious decision of what we want to do. And I did see another question, and I don't mean to get ahead, but someone asked, what about building small homes? What about, converting their garages and things like that? I love that idea. If people were willing to do it. But one thing that struck me in Erin's presentation was the idealism of an individual versus the community, right? And where do you stand? And so I think that for me, I don't think I'm going to convince a builder to take it in the teeth just to help, a community. They might, if it's their community and they're passionate about it, again, having that community mentality. But I think it's going to come down to the city, and it's going to come down to the inhabitants of the city to say, no, we want this. Let's move forward and put it in that budget.
And I'll pass off that same question to you, Erin, too.
Yeah, if you hop on the city's website and go to the housing division, there is a page there that talks about some affordable housing efforts. And sometimes people I like to make a differentiation between housing affordability and affordable housing. I think affordable housing has a very specific kind of definition in terms of a particular amount of somebody's income. When you're talking about housing affordability and trying to reduce some of those prices for a developer, or just reducing some of these costs, finding some ways to kind of bite around the edges of this, because I'm very much with Joan. It's like, capitalism is just the name of the game, and that's what it is. But some of the things, you know, that the city is using, or I think that there's a component about using some federal dollars to help with some of these things. The city has an excise tax. I think that's relatively new. So that's a small amount of money that gets put into a pool to sort of help with these items. We have an urban renewal initiative in South Corvallis. So as the property tax rates go up, that money's pooled and it's used. But I'm not sure if that money that may or may not go to affordable housing initiatives. Again, I'm not the housing planner. And then, you know, but on my end of things, this component about reducing cumbersome standards. So, you know, for example, off-street parking being a principal one, but there are all sorts of, there's a balance that communities have to strike, and it's very difficult. Some communities lean much more towards having more rules in place. Corvallis has a pretty thick code, you know, and it speaks to our value of livability and making sure that our development and that our city is, you know, at a particular level. But it's this trade-off, because the more standards that you put in place, the higher the bar you're setting, the more money a developer has to spend in order to actually get the project done. So those are a couple of the things off of the top of my head. But yeah, it's certainly not easy, no matter how you slice it.
Good points.
The age-old question, where to find the money. And I think building kind of on your trade-off conversation there's a couple people just asking how they as public can advocate for changing those minimum parking requirements.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to reduce or eliminate parking requirements, you're talking about making changes to the land development code. So there's a process for that, but there's also just this piece about being in touch with your elected officials and letting them know that that is your value. I don't know. My take is that generally speaking, that's not really where our community has really expressed it the way it wants to go. We haven't gotten direction as staff to go ahead and craft a text amendment, you know, in that way. So you can attend a meeting, you can attend a planning commission meeting, you could attend a city council meeting, you could submit testimony, you could speak. You know, we're constantly working on text amendments, and that would be the process for that. We also have, you know, different boards and coalitions. We've got a sustainability board. And so all of these different varieties of public participation, public involvement, and letting your elected officials know that that's what you want to see from our community is really the way that we get the ball rolling in that direction.
We've got time for a couple more questions. And so we've got one for you, Joan. Do you have any sense that neighbors are resistant to people of color moving into their neighborhood?
So, and Aaron, this might be more of a question that you can answer as well, because since I'm on the financing end, you know, people don't really talk about that piece of it on the financing end. So I don't really hear much of that in that sense. I think I heard Aaron say he's heard some things like that where when maybe there's some initiatives and around affordable housing and people saying, you know, more so I don't want poor people living in my neighborhood, but I haven't necessarily heard any of that direct feedback per se.
What about you, Aaron? Have you come across it kind of beyond that?
No, I haven't. You know, when I was asked to participate in this evening's discussion, we're talking about these barriers for people of color. You know, my first kind of question is, what people of color are we talking about? There's not a lot of people of color to begin with, right? And that ties back to this presentation that I gave. I mean, we've set the stage where we're kind of beyond. There aren't a lot of people of color to speak of. So, so I don't think that the concern for people who would express race, these racist opinions really need to go so far as to say, I don't want people of color living next to me, but when you say, I don't want poor people living next to me, who are we talking about? Who are those poor people? They're not necessarily people of color, but statistically, people of color are more likely to be on the lower end of the income spectrum. So, it's all very nuanced at this point, and that's why I'm trying to put across this point that we need to really think about our history and how these policies and kind of backdoor sort of ways tie in to these these monsters of our past.
Perfect. And I think let's jump into, we've got time for just a kind of a couple more. That's, I think, a really good point is just to look at our history and the exclusionary kind of policies that we've had in the past that's kind of restricting what we see in our community. And so I think we've got a couple. Could aggressive pursuit of public housing help bring down the cost of housing in Corvallis? I don't know if that's applicable.
I mean, I just don't know how you get there. It ties into these other questions about like who's going to build it, how does that financially pencil out? Where does the money come from? Where does the land come from? I mean, so there's a lot there in terms of we just don't. There's a lot of components to trying to get housing built. I mean, even just for a market rate developer, there's a tremendous number of steps that have to be taken, hurdles that need to be jumped over to get a development project off the ground. And so when it comes to affordable housing, it's just that much more difficult.
And then still chatting a little bit about the affordable housing, there's a question of, as cities get bigger, people have to travel farther for services and work unless zoning allows commercial and industrial uses throughout the city. How would mixed use zoning impact affordable housing availability?
I feel like we're getting deep now.
We're launching into the nitty gritty.
Yeah, well, again, yeah, people do have to commute farther based on the way that we are currently operating. Absolutely. Mixed use, more mixed use development is absolutely kind of one component of sort of reducing transit, reducing these commuting times. It can bring down some of the costs in some ways. Absolutely. I'm not sure if that type of development, at least in Corvallis, would have a significant impact on the discussion topic at hand this evening. But I don't know. I'd have to think about that a little bit more. That there's a lot to that, certainly.
Yeah, and my initial thoughts are, and again, remember, I'm the bank, so I'm the financing side. Mixed use might actually be more attractive to builders and people coming in and wanting to do something. So because they're able to diversify a little bit with that mixed use. So just kind of the initial thoughts on that.
And then I think we've got just a couple comments kind of building on that, just to note that we have a mixed use recommendations committee at the City of Corvallis, as well as a missing middle housing advisory board that's working on implementing some code changes, including that parking conversation. And the same note that checking out the city's website is a great place to start to see what that committee work is looking like and where it's going. And then Joan, so there's just a question of, would banks be willing to finance those trees or quads if they were separated, sort of like condos, but wouldn't have an HOA. It's an opportunity for people to begin to get equity in their home.
So the simple answer is banks will finance anything that holds their value. That being said, we use the word stabilization a lot in banking. So if you think of, I'm going to go real plain on this. If you think of a manufactured home, we're going to ask you, is it on a foundation? Is it not? Because that makes a difference. One's stable, one isn't when it comes to the value. So it's really going to depend on if it's able to keep its value. And if I happen as a bank to have to own it one day, can I turn around and at least get my money back out of it? So it's all about value. You're going to run into all kinds of policies at banks about what they will and won't finance. And that's really what's driving it.
And then I think we've got time just for one last question. And so we've got a question to both of you. Joan, you were recently appointed to the LBCC board, and Aaron, you deal with OSU issues and land use all the time. For both of you, do you think there are issues for students who are also people of color?
Yeah.
There are issues for all people of color. that comes with the territory. I don't interface I don't interface a lot with students in particular. Everybody's got their own story when it comes to what that journey has looked like for them.
Yeah, and I get the great privilege of serving not only on the LBCC board of education, but also on the foundation board there. And it's where the foundation does its work that I get to see, I guess maybe some of the disparities, some of the help that's needed. And I'm going to start real baseline first. Students just need help, whether they're students of color or not. Some of the emergency funding that we put in place there is amazing. And I don't mean that to be a public service announcement, but community colleges, I just think are amazing places, and what they do for the community is an amazing thing. That being said, one thing at LBCC that I know we work on very continuously is this notion of making sure that we have the equity, we have the diversity, we're able to make sure that those students feel welcome in that environment. And it's a job. I mean, it's a constant conversation to ensure that how they're doing and what struggles do they have. So to separate a student from a student of color, our new president, Lisa Avery, is doing an amazing job of keeping us informed of some of those disparities, especially in the past in LBCC, and what can we do in the future to make sure that enrollment is, equitable. And, if we're not seeing, some of the Hispanic population or Latinos, what are we doing wrong? How do we get this information to them and making sure that they feel like they're a part of a community that is really diverse? But all students struggle, unfortunately.
That's a good point. Well, perfect. We're kind of rounding up on 8 o'clock, so we'll bring things to a close here. But I just want to thank our panelists for taking their time out of their evening to chat with us and share their expertise and opinion. And I do want to share with you guys out, there is just in the chat, if I can be technologically savvy, some additional resources if you're wanting to kind of learn a little bit more about people of color, redlining, as Joan has been mentioning. There's some really good resources out there that explain it a little bit more in depth and the impacts that we're seeing and the exclusionary kind of laws that were in place and those impacts that are affecting our property taxes, and that's kind of what's going into our schooling right now. And so there's some really great resources if you want to take the time, as well as a recommendation from one of our Q&A people for a book, The Color of Law. And so just kind of ending out things, I did just want to thank both of them for taking their time and all of you for taking time to contribute questions and be here this evening. It's a lot of information to sit with, and it's not always the most comfortable conversation for people, but it's something that it's important that we're taking the time to educate ourselves and kind of start to challenge those issues. One of the quotes that I came across kind of in prepping for this meeting that I thought was really poignant and kind of described the problem is that it's not an issue about there's just kind of a single, we like to talk about like a single bad apple. but it's from a TED Talk from Megan Francis, in which she said, the problem is not that we have a few bad apples, it's that we have an entire infected tree. And so I think that's an issue that we're looking at here, is that we have a lot of these kind of policies that are built into our historical housing practices, as well as kind of the way that we set our land use financing. And so that's something that's affecting us today. Historically, discrimination in US housing policy, particularly discrimination against Black Americans, is one of the chief drivers of racial inequities that still persist today. And it's one of those conversations that we have to continue to have and look at in our work. And another quote from Megan Francis, she said, fixes that do not address the root causes of an issue are simply not fixes at all. So it's important that we start to continue to talk about the role that our housing policy has in causing our nation's racial disparities and the role that it must have in solving them. And I think this is kind of good conversation just to start to look at that and look at those practices and see that we still do have some things on the books and redlining and historically how it's affecting people as they walk into banks today. And so I think it's a lot of really good information, and I don't think there's any way we could touch on all of it in an hour. So hopefully you guys will take some time to kind of read some more resources and connect back, but I appreciate all of you being here.
Tabitha, let me just say, if somebody wants to access my PowerPoint, I'm happy to share it. I kind of had a script I was working on. I'm happy to share that. I work for the city, so I'm here to serve this community. And if anybody wants to give me a call further discuss this, has more questions, feel free to reach out to me because that's my job.
Perfect. I think that is great. And I'm sure there is I think we have a website or Facebook page that we can share out the recording of this chat as well as materials on. I might be wrong, but Jessica might have the answer on that for the League of Women Voters.
Yes, the recording of this is being recorded, and we have a YouTube channel at the League, and we will be getting that up sometime in the next week.
Okay, thank you guys. I appreciate y'all being here, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.